Look closely at the yellowed pages of operational reports from March of 1944. While the Soviet Information Bureau triumphantly reported to the entire country about the complete lifting of the siege of Leningrad and the rapid liberation of Right Bank Ukraine, a completely different, profound, and frightening drama was playing out in the remote forests and marshy swamps on the approaches to Pskov. On the desk of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief lay a top-secret report in which the commander of one of the rifle divisions stated in plain text that his regiments had only 40 to 50 capable bayonets left, but the order to attack the German reinforced concrete fortifications head-on at dawn had not been rescinded. This was the tragedy of the Panther Line, the most powerful defensive boundary, the assault of which Soviet school history textbooks would later prefer to describe extremely sparingly, casually referring to these bloody events as battles of local significance. But for thousands of soldiers left lying in the Pskov soil, these battles became the main and final boundary, exposing a terrible crisis in military command and the formulaic thinking of the Soviet generals in the middle of the Great Patriotic War. Today, we will remove the glossy facade of victorious bulletins and conduct an honest, detailed investigation into why the brilliant offensive of the Red Army in the winter of 1944 suddenly ran into a solid concrete wall, and what price had to be paid for the High Command's unwillingness to recognize the enemy's tactical strength and prudence. Let's restore the chronology and understand the context in which these fateful decisions were made. By the beginning of February 1944, the troops of the Leningrad, Volkhov, and Second Baltic Fronts had carried out a brilliant operation, pushing the German Army Group North back from Leningrad by 150, and in some places, 300 kilometers. On the wave of this colossal, long-awaited success, a perfectly understandable but extremely dangerous feeling of euphoria arose in Moscow. The strategic leadership at the Stavka believed that the German troops were finally demoralized, defeated, and fleeing without looking back, and therefore needed to be pursued without stopping, bursting into the Baltics on the move. The commander of the Leningrad Front, General Leonid Govorov, and the commander of the Second Baltic Front, General Markian Popov, were given strict, uncompromising directives. Without allowing the enemy to consolidate, break through his defenses, capture Pskov and Ostrov by the beginning of March, and then develop the offensive towards Riga and Tallinn. On paper, this plan looked flawless, in the spirit of the best canons of a deep offensive operation. But the staff officers in distant Moscow failed to consider one critical factor. The German army was not retreating chaotically. It was withdrawing in an organized and systematic manner to a pre-prepared, deeply echeloned defensive line, which had been built over an entire year with truly German pedantry. This line was the Panther Line, which became the northern part of the so-called Eastern Wall. Let's mentally unfold the operational map of this area to understand exactly what the Russian soldier faced. The geography of the Pskov region seems created for solid, impregnable defense. From the north, the line was reliably covered by the giant water expanse of Lake Pskov and Lake Peipus, completely excluding any flanking maneuvers. To the south stretched endless, impassable forests and raised bogs, which in spring turned into a veritable liquid mess. The only available corridor for the advance of large troop masses remained the narrow isthmus between the lakes and the marshy lowland of the Velikaya River. It was here, on the approaches to ancient Pskov, that German engineers erected a defensive masterpiece. These were not the usual full-profile earthen trenches. This was a deeply echeloned defense, consisting of several belts extending 30 to 40 kilometers deep. The backbone of the line consisted of permanent firing points, abbreviated as bunkers. The Germans built hundreds of reinforced concrete structures here, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a heavy, large-caliber artillery shell. Moreover, they widely used the so-called crabs, armored machine gun cupolas that were buried in the ground up to the embrasure, making them practically invisible to our observers. In front of these firing points were kilometers of Bruno coils, anti-infantry wire obstacles, and continuous minefields where every meter of ground had been pre-zeroed by German artillerymen and mortarmen. And it was against this armored wall, in mid-February of 1944, that the forward units of the Soviet armies emerged. Let us consider the physical and moral state of our soldiers at that moment. They had been advancing continuously for over a month, having covered hundreds of kilometers through snow-covered forests and trackless terrain in heavy fighting. The men were mortally exhausted. Regiments and divisions were bled dry, and companies sometimes had less than a third of their official strength remaining. But matters were even worse with rear support. The advancing troops had broken away from their supply bases and railway junctions by vast distances. All front-line infrastructure had been completely destroyed by the retreating enemy. Bridges blown up, crossings burned, roads mined. And at this very moment, nature delivered another terrible surprise. An early, unusually violent spring thaw began. The condition of the roads became catastrophic. Heavy equipment, tanks, and, most importantly, high-powered artillery were hopelessly stuck in the impassable mud of the Pskov backroads. Shells and food had to be delivered to the soldiers on ordinary horse-drawn carts, and more often than not, carried on their own shoulders for tens of kilometers forward. Under such conditions, according to all the rules of military science, the offensive operation should have been immediately halted. It was necessary to bring up the rear, replenish the divisions with manpower, deliver a sufficient quantity of ammunition, conduct thorough engineering reconnaissance of the enemy's defensive line, and organize a powerful artillery fist to breach the concrete fortifications. But the logic of the high Soviet command was different. From Moscow came categorical orders demanding an immediate assault. General Govorov, bowing to pressure from the Stavka, demanded that the commanders of the 42nd and 67th Armies attack Pskov on the move. Our troops were not given a single day for preparation. Due to a lack of shells, the artillery preparation before attacks was purely symbolic. Guns fired a few shells per barrel simply for reporting purposes. Soviet aviation, due to poor spring weather, low cloud cover, and waterlogged dirt airfields, practically could not get airborne to suppress the German batteries. As a result, our rifle battalions were thrown into battle against an unsuppressed, fully combat-ready German defense. Let us reconstruct the picture of this terrible attack, as seen by the ordinary participants of the events. The infantry rose from the slushy snow and advanced across the open, absolutely flat field before the German positions. As soon as the lines of soldiers neared the obstacles, those very hidden German bunkers and machine gun nests, whose existence our reconnaissance had not even guessed due to the haste, came to life. Dense, interlocking machine gun fire literally mowed down our ranks. The soldiers were pinned to the muddy ground. There was absolutely nowhere to take cover, and from behind, over the radios, came the furious shouts of staff commanders demanding they move forward at any cost, fulfill the combat mission, and carry out the front's directive. The supporting tanks, which they managed to throw into battle, immediately became easy prey for German anti-tank guns, as they either got stuck in the swampy muck or blew up on uncleared minefields. It was a true conveyor belt of human sacrifice, operating at full capacity day after day. And here arises a question that was hushed up for many years by official historians. Why did Soviet generals continue these frontal attacks for several weeks, perfectly aware of their complete ineffectiveness and catastrophic losses? Uncovering the reasons for this operational blindness, modern independent researchers point to a severe systemic flaw in the military command of that period, which can be characterized as template thinking and a panicked fear of failing to carry out orders from above. The command of the fronts and armies found itself held hostage by its own victorious reports from January. To admit to Stalin that the offensive had run out of steam and that the German defense had turned out to be stronger than anticipated, for many generals meant not just the loss of their positions, but the collapse of their entire careers, and possibly a military tribunal. It seemed simpler and safer to send new reinforcements into battle again and again, hoping that the German defense was about to crack under continuous pressure. But the German defense did not crack, because behind the Panther Line stood experienced regular units of the 18th German Army, led by General Georg Lindemann, who knew the strengths and weaknesses of Soviet tactics perfectly and skillfully exploited every mistake of our command. Let's look at these events through the eyes of the opposite side, turning to the documents of the German Military Archive and the memoirs of Wehrmacht officers. If we carefully study the reports of the Army Group North headquarters, we will see a strange thing, mixed with a feeling of arrogant surprise. German commanders noted that the Soviet attacks near Pskov were repeated with astonishing, almost mechanical stubbornness on the same sectors of the front. Day after day, at the same time, Soviet infantry rose to attack the same German strongpoints without attempting to probe for weak spots, outflank them, or apply new tactical methods. German machine gunners simply mowed down the advancing chains, after which Wehrmacht artillery pounded the locations of our reserves. In German documents, this operation is described as a defensive triumph that proved the superiority of German military doctrine over what they called the mass, unorganized attacks of the Russians. Of course, one cannot blindly believe every word of the German generals, who in their memoirs always sought to exaggerate their own successes and whitewash themselves, but facts remain facts. The Soviet offensive near Pskov in February-March of 1944 was completely paralyzed and halted. In official Soviet historiography, created in the post-war decades, these events received a completely different interpretation. Stalinist and later academic historians argued that the battles near Pskov and Ostrov in the spring of 1944 were of enormous strategic significance. According to their version, the continuous attacks of Soviet troops on the Panther Line pinned down large mobile enemy reserves, including Wehrmacht tank divisions, to the northern sector of the front. This allegedly prevented the German command from transferring forces to the south, where a grand offensive by Soviet fronts was developing in Ukraine at that time, leading to the defeat of Army Group South. The Soviet point of view states that the sacrifices of the Pskov operation were not in vain. They served the common cause of the future great victory, and the operation itself fulfilled its auxiliary role by exhausting and bleeding the defending German grouping. The logic of this concept is clear. To turn an obvious operational defeat into an element of overall strategic success, justifying the enormous losses with geopolitical necessity. However, in April 1944, when the fighting on the Panther Line finally subsided due to the complete exhaustion of offensive potential, the situation was assessed far less favorably in the Kremlin. Stalin was enraged by the failure of the offensive in the Baltics. To investigate the causes of the catastrophe on the northwestern axis, a special emergency commission of the State Defense Committee was created, headed by Georgy Malenkov. It included the most prominent party officials and military specialists: Shcherbakov, Bulganin, and Shtimenko. The commission worked directly at the headquarters of the fronts and armies, studied operational documents, combat logs, and conducted interrogations of the command staff. And the conclusions made in the final report to Stalin still amaze with their severity and frankness. The commission uncovered facts of egregious incompetence, criminal negligence, and what in military parlance is called eyewash. That is, the conscious distortion of facts in reports to conceal one's own mistakes. The Malenkov Commission's report stated in plain text that the command of the fronts and armies had shown a complete inability to organize a breakthrough of a modern, prepared enemy defense. The generals were accused of throwing men into battle in a fragmented manner, in small units, without proper coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery. Artillery chiefs planned fire by area, not knowing the exact locations of German firing points, resulting in shells being wasted, plowing up empty ground while German pillboxes remained unharmed. Moreover, the commission uncovered terrible facts of concealing actual losses. Army headquarters practiced compiling false reports in which the number of personnel was artificially inflated to continue receiving combat tasks from the front, while battalions existed only on paper. As a result of this commission's work, harsh organizational conclusions followed. The commander of the Second Baltic Front, General Markian Popov, was removed from his post and demoted. Many lower-ranking generals received strict reprimands and were relieved of command of divisions and corps. The Volkhov Front was completely disbanded, and its troops were distributed among neighboring fronts to improve manageability. Let's conduct a thought experiment and consider an alternative scenario. What would have happened if the Soviet command in mid-February 1944 had shown flexibility, listened to reports from the front lines, and stopped the offensive in time? If the troops had been given a respite of 3 to 4 weeks, during which time the destroyed railways could have been fully restored, heavy breakthrough artillery brought up, several full loads of shells accumulated for each gun, and a full, detailed aerial reconnaissance of the Panther Line conducted. Obviously, the subsequent assault would have cost the Red Army immeasurably fewer human casualties, and the breakthrough of the German line could have been achieved much faster and more effectively, opening the way deep into the Baltics as early as the spring of 1944. But in the rigid, command administrative system of that time, focused on immediate results at any cost and strict calendar deadlines, such a scenario was practically impossible. The system demanded forward movement, regardless of the mud, the lack of shells, and the mountains of corpses in front of German machine gun nests. Contemporary independent military historians, analyzing the assault on the Panther Line from the vantage point of today, and with access to the archives of both sides, conclude that this operation became a classic example of the so-called positional crisis of the mid-war period. By the beginning of 1944, the Red Army had already learned to brilliantly execute mobile operations, encircling the enemy in open fields, as was done at Stalingrad or in the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky Cauldron. However, storming a pre-prepared, long-term fortified line under the most severe conditions of the spring thaw required a completely different level of military art, the highest precision in planning, and colossal logistical support. Our troops near Pskov in February of 1944 had none of this. It was an attempt to take a powerful modern fortress bare-handed, with the forces of exhausted and depleted infantry. The result of this rigidity and stubbornness was enormous, irreplaceable losses, the exact numbers of which still provoke fierce debate among researchers, ranging from tens to hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded soldiers. And so now, as this vast, tragic, and profound panorama of the battles near Pskov has unfolded before you, as we have meticulously examined the iron logic of official Soviet documents, the justifications of German generals, and the harsh conclusions of Malenkov's Emergency Commission, we approach the main historical paradox of this forgotten battle. A deep moral and professional question arises before us, one for which there is no, and cannot be, a simple, unambiguous answer. On one hand, the assault on the Panther Line can be viewed as an inevitable, cruel tragedy of war, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of the future common victory. When an exhausted army was forced to attack the enemy head-on to tie down its forces and ensure grand success on other, more important strategic fronts. On the other hand, it is impossible to ignore the obvious facts of rigid thinking, operational blindness, and the careerist ambitions of the generals who, fearing Stalin's wrath, continued for weeks to drive depleted regiments against unsuppressed concrete pillboxes, turning a military operation into a meaningless and horrific slaughter. Weigh all the arguments I have presented. Reflect on the fates of those soldiers whose remains are still found by search teams in the forests of Pskov, and decide for yourself. What was the assault on the Panther Line in 1944? The inevitable price for the right to enter the Baltics? Or a tragic example of the bloody incompetence of the command, which official history preferred to forget? Share your opinion. Express your point of view in the comments under this video, for only through honest, open, and unbiased discussion of the most difficult pages of our past can we approach true, genuine historical justice.